Bye Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and in this video I want to talk about a topic that gets debated amongst Lord of the Rings fans a lot, and that is, who is the actual hero of the story? Now, of course, Lord of the Rings is a very complex story. It's got a lot of different storylines running through it, and it's an ensemble cast. You have the Fellowship, and each one of them is kind of the hero of their own individual story. But if we're looking at the story as a whole, who is the main hero in the effort to defeat Sauron and destroy the ring? Now, that's a careful question because we have to really be careful about what question we're answering to make sure we get the answer right. And the answer is going to be either Frodo or Sam. I don't think there's really going to be a whole lot of debate there. Aragorn and Gandalf are, of course, heroes in their own ways. Gandalf is kind of the hero of the long war against Sauron. Aragorn is hero in terms of the military fight against Sauron. But in terms of destroying the ring, we really only have two options, because Frodo and Sam are the only two left by the time we get to Mount Doom. So those are really the two options we're looking at, but the question is, which one actually is the hero at the end of the day? Well, let's take a look at the events of the story and see if we can figure it out. Now, for purposes of this analysis, I'm going to be looking at the novel, not the movie. And that's important because in the movie, Frodo is a lot more of a passive character than he is in the book. So let's take a look at why that is. We've got Frodo in the very early part of the story definitely being a lot more active than Sam. Frodo in both the movie and the book in the Fellowship of the Ring really is kind of the primary character, with Sam being mainly there for kind of side commentary. He has his own views and he does, some talking and adds some comic relief and that sort of thing, but he doesn't take a huge role in terms of advancing the plot or, making progress in the story. So there's a lot of that going on in the early part of the story. In the Two Towers, we start to see Sam pick up a little bit more in terms of his own agency, making his own ideas known, taking a more active role. And in The Return of the King, he really steps up and kind of becomes the main actor in terms of finishing the quest. So let's take a look at all three books, get an idea of what each of these two characters is doing, and then we'll get an idea of who is going to be the real hero. So as I mentioned, the Fellowship of the Ring, we see Frodo being the one who takes the most action, who does most of the work in terms of progressing the story. The most active role we ever see Sam take is really, he kind of objects to taking Strider along at Bree. He really, beyond that, there's not a whole lot. I mean, we learn in the book that Merry and Pippin have kind of been using Sam as a spy to keep track of what Frodo's doing, because they kind of know what's going on and they're trying to be prepared so they can go with him. This all gets left out of the movie, and I'll do a video on some of that material at some point, kind of to highlight the differences between the two. But for purposes of our discussion here, the two things that we really see Sam doing in terms of taking an active role in progressing the story is really those two things. And really, his spying on Frodo doesn't progress the story that much. It's something we find out kind of after the fact. It doesn't change anything. His objection to Strider is overridden, so that doesn't really change much of anything either, but we do see him kind of pop up and assert his own opinion and will in the matter to the extent that he can. Other than that, most of what he does, again, is kind of relegated to commentary. We get his comment on, why didn't I pack rope? I know I'm going to need it. Or all the stuff he says about elves and being in love with elves. Frodo, on the other hand, is much more active in the Fellowship of the Ring. Frodo, of course, is the one who makes the decision that he's going to have to leave the Shire with the ring, unlike in the movie where Gandalf kind of decides that for him. That's kind of annoying. That's one way in which, again, the movie makes him much more passive. What else does he do? He, of course, is the one who makes a lot of the decisions as far as where to go and how to go. Once he realizes the Black Riders are on their tail, they discuss in Crick Hollow what they're going to do, and he says, well, let's go through the Old Forest, see if we can lose them, and that leads to all sorts of adventures in the Old Forest, which I've done videos on. You can check those links in the description below. he's making most of the main decisions until they meet Strider, and at that point he's kind of trusting Strider. But even that is a decision that is a very important decision he has to make. He has to decide, is this person really somebody that I can trust? Should I trust them? And so we get that. Other things that we see about Frodo that are more active in the book, although not as plot heavy, in the fight in Moria where they get attacked in the room with Balin's tomb, Frodo actually takes a more active role in the fight itself. At one point, a huge foot kind of sticks itself through the door, and it's presumably a troll's foot. We never actually see the troll in the book, but Boromir kind of hacks at it, and his sword just bounces back. It doesn't have any effect. Frodo then actually leaps forward and stabs the thing in the foot, and actually does have some effect. He almost loses sting because when the foot pulls back, it almost pulls it out of his hand. But we see him taking a more active role. And similarly, at the battle on Weathertop, battle may be a little overglorified term for that, but we also see Frodo taking a little bit more of an active role because he actually attacks the Witch King. He again kind of lunges at the Witch King trying to attack him. He misses, we find out later, and he only apparently tore the cloak. But still, he's doing more than just kind of passively sitting there terrified on the floor like we in the movie. So he's definitely a more active player. Also in the Council of Elrond, he takes a slightly more, maybe not really. I mean, it's probably about the same, but in the context of the movie, it makes it seem like he's kind of doing it out of a sense of, everybody else is bickering, I have to stop the arguing. Whereas in the book, there's a kind of a silence, everybody's thinking, and he pipes up. It's a more active, he's not doing something different, but the context of it makes it a little more active because he's not just trying to put an end to the debate. He really is in a context of everybody's trying to think about what to do, and he says, I'll do it. So he's actually stepping forward a bit more in that sense, I think, in the book than in the movie. And then for the rest of the book, what we see is mostly Gandalf and Aragorn leading the company. We don't see a whole lot of what Frodo does in terms of taking an active role because at that point he has a guide. And the same goes for Sam. There's not really much for him to do either. Frodo does have, of course, his encounter with Galadriel, with the Mirror of Galadriel, and his role and Sam's role in that encounter. Well, Sam actually has a role in that encounter. That's another video I'll have to do at some point because they left that out of the movie. Frodo's role is not significantly different in terms of being more or less active in that scene. And then, of course, we get, as they're floating down the Anduin River and making their way towards where they will eventually have the breaking of the Fellowship, we don't see a whole lot of activity there either, simply because they're mostly just kind of floating along. Eventually it comes down to, they have to decide which way to go. Are they going to go west toward Minas Tirith first, or are they going to go east to try to finish, the actual task at hand? The decision is left up to Frodo, and he's basically trying to decide. He kind of knows in his mind what he has to do. He's just afraid to do it, which is kind of what he tells Galadriel in the movie, but we get that more in the book at this point. So he's trying to do that, and Boromir's attack on him is kind of what solidifies his opinion. And then we see really the last thing that Sam does that really is an active role in the story. Sam realizes when everybody's out looking for Frodo, wait a minute, if Frodo, as I think, is going to try to go off on his own, and that's a whole conversation he has with the other members of the Fellowship, he has to go back to the boats because that's where everything is. He has to have some gear. He has to find a way across the river. So he actually goes back, jumps in the river, almost drowns. It's one of the more active things he does in the Fellowship of the Ring. But most of the activity, to the extent that either of these two characters have any activity, really is Frodo's. Now let's take a look at the Two Towers. In the Two Towers, we start to see Sam become a lot more active. But a lot of the activity is really in terms of kind of exerting his opinion without really having any effect, because in this particular case, most of the story in the Two Towers is Frodo and Sam being led by Gollum. And a lot of what Sam's activity is, to the extent that he has it, is expressing his opinion that we shouldn't be trusting Gollum. Frodo is the boss, and so he ends up ruling the day. But even Frodo is not that active in the story at this point. There's not a whole lot that goes on where either of them make a huge contribution to the advance of the plot, because they're basically following Gollum for a lot of the Two Towers. The main things that we see are the encounter with Faramir, where Frodo has to very carefully avoid saying certain things to tip Faramir off as to what they're doing, because he's trying to keep the mission a secret. He also intervenes to save Gollum, whereas Sam really would have preferred to not save Gollum in that instance. So Frodo is still taking an active role. Sam is taking an active role to the extent that he is basically telling Frodo, I think we should be doing it a little bit differently. And he also does tell Frodo things like when he overhears Gollum kind of plotting to get them killed, he tells Frodo that and whatnot. And Frodo doesn't, as in the movie, really disregard Sam or blow it off. He takes it into account and he says, well, I'm sure he is going to try to kill us, but for now we have to deal with it because we have to have a way into Mordor. So they're both kind of equal in the sense that neither of them really is doing anything on their own because they're kind of following Gollum. Frodo is more active in the sense that he has the ultimate decision making power to decide to follow Gollum, whereas Sam just ends up bowing to Frodo's wishes on the matter. But most of this Two Towers doesn't really involve a lot of active role on either of their parts. The most active either of them really gets is when we finally get to Cirith Ungol and they encounter Shelob, where Gollum tries to leave them behind. And again, this is another difference between the movies and the books. So if you haven't read the book, Frodo doesn't send Sam back. They're always together the whole time, pretty much. And they're both trying to avoid Shelob together. Now, at this point, they both just take a really active role in trying to escape and not get killed by the giant spider. Neither of them are really more active than the other in that sense. They're both just doing what they can to survive. And then, at the end of it, what we see is Frodo gets stung by Shelob. Sam has to fight off Gollum because he tries to intervene to keep Sam from rescuing Frodo. He fights off Gollum and then fights off Shelob, and then he has to decide what to do because now Frodo appears to be dead. And this is where Sam's role in the story really starts to pick up, and he becomes the primary player in a sense, because at this stage he has to decide, what do I do? I mean, I can't just go back because there's no time for that. I can't just sit here and wait for the orcs to capture me. He finally decides, I guess I have to go on. So he takes the ring, and this is the most active thing he's ever done, and it even kind of puts it in those terms in Sam's mind. He's basically thinking, it's not my place to step up to this big of a role, and yet he has to. So this is where he really starts becoming a more active participant. He takes the ring, and he kind of starts working his way into Mordor. Realizes after overhearing the orcs, finding out that Frodo's alive. Now he's, oh my gosh, I did the wrong thing. Which, debatable. Did he actually do the wrong thing? That's an interesting conversation to have in and of itself. But once he finds out that Frodo really is still alive, he decides, all right, I can't leave Frodo here. I have to rescue him. And so he's going to try to rescue him, even if it endangers the mission. So he tries to do that. And where the Two Towers book leaves off is actually he's following the orcs. The orcs make it into Cirith Ungol, the tower, and they close a door right before he gets there. He runs into it, passes out, because he literally knocks himself out running into the door. And that's where we leave Frodo and Sam in the Two Towers. But we see the beginning of Sam really taking an active role because he actually takes the ring and he's going to finish the quest himself until he realizes what has actually happened with Frodo. And so at that point, now we get to see what plays out in the Return of the King in terms of Sam taking an active role. Now, in Return of the King, Frodo becomes very passive, and it's partially because he's wounded. It's partially because the weight of the ring is becoming almost unbearable. But when Sam finally rescues Frodo, Frodo, at first remains a fairly active participant in all this. He tries to help Sam come up with a plan. What are we going to do? They decide to dress up as orcs so they can not be quite as obvious sore thumbs in Mordor. Once they get out of Cirith Ungol, though, almost the first thing that happens is they run into a band of orcs that are making their way to the Black Gate in the north in order to meet Aragorn's army. And as a result of that, Frodo and Sam are dragged along almost all the way to the Black Gate. And Frodo at this point is pretty run down. I mean, he's almost to the point of literally being too exhausted to continue. After this point, Frodo really does become a very passive character for the rest of, this particular story. So you get Sam making a lot of the decisions, and even a couple times Frodo basically says, I don't have anything left. I don't have any hope left. I don't have any, I'll go with you, Sam. If you have hope left, you have it for both of us. But he basically just says, I'm done. I can't do it anymore. And Sam basically has to do it for both of them. I mean, he ends up carrying Frodo on his back on the slopes of Mount Doom. And that's, an expression of how tired and worn down Frodo really is. And again, it's partially because of his wound. It's partially because the weight of the ring. But regardless, Sam is basically having to do a lot of the work, and even, a lot of the willpower he's exerting on Frodo's behalf, not just his own. And it's kind of it's interesting because in the book we see a little bit more of his thought processes because the narrator can describe it to us, whereas in the movie you don't really see it. But in the book, he is kind of described as having almost a fatalistic sense of probably going to die, but all the more reason to just carry on and do the thing. So he gets this idea that, it's probably hopeless, but I can't give up anyway. I just have to do it. And so it kind of just turns him into a rock that he's gonna plow through as best he can. Frodo, at this point has basically not succumbed to the ring really, but he's just so worn out that he can't exert will on his own. I mean, he goes with Sam, but Sam is really the driving factor at this point. So up to the point where Gollum comes back and tries to attack them, Frodo doesn't do much. He's mostly just going along with Sam. And Sam is the one who Sam ends up taking a lot of risks. He lets Frodo sleep when he's exhausted and goes off and tries to find water, things like this. Frodo basically is walking with Sam until he can't walk anymore, and then he sleeps. That's kind of what he does. And then when Gollum attacks, then we see, Frodo finally gets some energy because it's kind of the ring at risk, and that, wakes up the inner I must have the ring element in his brain. And so while Sam is holding off Gollum, he actually finds the energy to actually run to the doors into Mount Doom. And then, of course, what we finally get is, he can't destroy the ring, and then Gollum intervenes, and it's because of Gollum's intervention that the ring is destroyed. At that point, neither Frodo nor Sam is really the active participant there. Frodo is, if anything, going the wrong way because the ring is just too powerful. It's overwhelmed him. And then Gollum steps in, and again, difference between the movie and the book. In the book, what happens, in case you haven't read it, Gollum takes the ring, bites Frodo's finger off, and when he has the ring, he's just dancing around for pure happiness, and because he's not paying attention, falls off the ledge. I mean, at that point, it's really just kind of an act of providence, and Tolkien describes it as such in one of his letters. So that's really the last thing we see as far as the quest of the ring. Neither Frodo nor Sam accomplish the quest. Both of them, work their way towards the end of it, but neither of them actually accomplish it. Now, I mean, after that, you do get the Scouring of the Shire, but I don't want to really count the Scouring of the Shire as part of the overall analysis of who's the hero, because remember, my question was, who's the hero in terms of getting to, Mount Doom and destroying the ring, the quest against Sauron. That has ended at this point. I will say, just in passing, in case you're curious, I've done a video on the Scouring of the Shire, and I can link to that. But even in the Scouring of the Shire, we see Frodo being a fairly passive player. He's mainly acting as a restraining force, trying to keep the hobbits from killing people unnecessarily. Merry and Pippin take most of the active role in terms of leading the arrangement of, I hesitate to say army or forces because that sounds a little overglorified for hobbits, but, kind of leading the battle tactics and that sort of thing. Sam's main role is to go find Rosie and her family and kind of start organizing the resistance. Frodo is mainly, again, there to kind of make decisions in terms of, we're not going to do that. Hobbits are not going to start killing people unnecessarily. He is still a somewhat active participant, though, because he does have some say in terms of, saying, we're going to go find Lotho and we're going to make sure Lotho, Sackville Baggins, who he assumes is still in charge, when in fact it turns out he's dead. But he does have kind of an active role in terms of saying, we're going to set things right. But most of what he does in terms of the actual scouring of the Shire is mainly preventing hobbits from killing each other. And then at the end, he of course confronts Saruman, grants mercy to Saruman, basically on the grounds that Saruman is a Maya. We don't really have any business deciding his fate. So even there, even though he's making the decision in a very passive way, saying it's not my place to, decide any judgment of you because you're a totally different order of being. So anyway, that's just an aside. But for purposes of the actual quest of the ring, that part doesn't count. So let's take what we've seen together and see if we can decide who's the real hero here. So one of the things that we can see, as I've kind of discussed here, is in the Fellowship, Frodo is more active. In the Two Towers, we see Sam becoming more active. And finally, in the end, as they work their way to Mount Doom, Sam is really kind of the active player. So it all kind of balances out in a way, in the sense that you can't just look at which character is doing most of the decision-making or taking most of the actions, because both of them have roughly an equal amount of time in that role. So that by itself doesn't really tell us much. On the other hand, what we can see is the types of decisions being made and whatnot are different. Frodo in the Fellowship of the Ring is the one who decides to go on the quest on his own. He decides to take the ring from Rivendell on his own. He decides a lot of the major, to the extent that it gets to Rivendell, he does a lot of the major decision making in terms of how they're going to do it and that they're going to do it. After that, it's mostly just carrying through with the plan, and for a good chunk of it, Gandalf and Aragorn are providing guidance, and then Gollum is providing guidance after that. So, to that extent, nobody's really in charge between Frodo and Sam. Sam, when he takes a more active role, is mostly just trying to find the willpower to carry through with the decisions that have already been made. So in that sense, Frodo is really the driving force behind the entire thing. Sam at the end is really just carrying through on Frodo's original intent. Does that mean that Sam is not the hero? Not necessarily. I mean, you've got a lot of different things going on, and it gets complicated because neither of them could have finished the quest on their own, of course. Frodo couldn't have finished the quest without Sam because he wouldn't have had the willpower to make it. He was done by the time he got halfway through Mordor. He wouldn't have, of course he had to be rescued by Sam as well, but I'm leaving that aside. Sam couldn't really have finished it on his own either, though, because Frodo was really the wiser of the two in terms of figuring out, we're going to have to trust Gollum at least a little bit. Without Gollum, they really would not have made it into Mordor. And there is a sense in which Frodo is kind of the reason that it gets as far as it does. Sam, of course, in some ways saves the quest in ways that Frodo does not, because he takes the ring from Frodo and he resists the urge to use the ring in Mordor itself, which is quite a feat for somebody who's never even had to deal with that before. And so we can actually see a little bit too of the role of the small. Frodo is already kind of a representation of the small, but even among hobbits, Frodo is a relatively great person in the sense that he is wiser than most, knows more than most. Sam really is the small in the sense that not only is he a hobbit, he's a relatively uneducated hobbit. He's a gardener. He's not an important person in any sense of the word, you would think. But we see through his own simplicity and smallness his humility, and his humility is kind of what saves the quest ultimately. So again, we have different ways in which these two characters contribute to the final accomplishing of the mission, but which one really is the hero? I mean, part of me wants to just cop out and say they both are, and in a sense they both are, because again, neither of them could have done it without the other. But for my money, I think Frodo really is still the hero of the story because, like I said, Frodo ultimately is the one who makes the decision. Sam carries it out. Sam saves Frodo. He does some really important things along the way. But ultimately, I think Frodo is really the one who is the primary person that we're looking to as the protagonist. And part of the reason for that, too, in the Council of Elrond, whenever Frodo finally does pipe up and say, I will take the ring, Elrond says in the book, this isn't in the movie, he says, if I've heard everything right, then I believe this task has been appointed to you. And we also get some other hints along the way. In the movie, it's Galadriel. I'm not sure who it is in the book, but somebody does say, if you don't find a way, no one will. Frodo even says before they meet Gollum, but after they left the Fellowship, I think it's my fate to find some way into Mordor and accomplish this quest. So you could say, in a sense, neither of them are the real hero. It's kind of fate or providence or whatever you want to call it. But Frodo is still the one who is, acquiescing to what he sees as his destiny. He still has that choice. He could have said no. And so what we see is Frodo is not necessarily, he's kind of in a sense destined to do it, but he's the one who takes up that destiny willingly and decides to follow through with it. The fact that he ends up not being able to carry it through by himself is not a testament to his character. It's a testament to the power of the ring and other factors. But ultimately, because Frodo really does seem to be I hate to use a hackneyed phrase like the chosen one, but that's kind of what he is. And so Sam, of course, in the sense, is the hero of the later story. He's the hero at the end, but that's because he has to be to step up to save the quest. It's not because he's the hero of the overall quest. I think at the end of the day, that still is Frodo. They both, of course, are very important, and they both have their own roles, and their roles are very different. Frodo ultimately is kind of the decider of the two. Sam is more of the doer in the latter half of the story, but they're still both important, still very, neither one of them, as I said, could have finished the quest without the other. So that's why I think Frodo really is still the hero of the story. Now, Sam is an important factor because, as I mentioned, he represents the small, and of course, for Tolkien, small people doing great deeds is kind of the saving grace of the whole story. That's kind of the point. Frodo and Sam are both small, but Sam really represents, just your average person, whereas Frodo is slightly better than the average hobbit, still not as great as a great man or a great elf, but considering what he is, a hobbit, he is a greater person than Sam in that sense. But anyway, that's my analysis, so I'll just go ahead and leave it there. So that is my take on whether Frodo or Sam is the true hero of the quest of Mount Doom. Now again, if you want to look beyond that and tack on the Scouring of the Shire, you might come up with a slightly different answer, but I'm leaving that aside for the moment. If you have some different ideas, different conclusions and some additional facts you'd like to add in, please do leave those in the comments. I'm curious to get your thoughts on the whole question. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up, share it around, and if you want to learn more about Tolkien or the worlds he created, then please do subscribe to the channel. And you can also follow me on Twitter at JRRT Lore. Until next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.